Tracking breaks and lunches is optional, so why would you want to do it? Well, let's say, for example, that our policy is that employees get a 10-minute paid break in the morning, a 10-minute unpaid break in the afternoon, and a 30-minute unpaid lunch. We'll examine two similar time cards, one with break and lunch tracking enabled, and the other where it has not been enabled. Bob Driver has not been using the break and lunch tracking options, but we can still see that Bob had 3 work sessions on February 7th. That totaled about 8 hours. This makes sense because the morning break is a paid break, and so Bob just stayed on the clock. This means that lunch must have been the break between the first and second sessions. To find out how long a lunch Bob took, all you have to do is subtract the time out on the first session from the time in on the second. It was about 30 minutes. That means that Bob's unpaid afternoon break was between the second and third session. Again, to determine the length of the break, just subtract the time out of the second session from the time in of the last session. By looking at the daily, weekly totals and the time card summary, we can easily see that Bob worked about 7 hours and 50 minutes. Now let's take a look at Joe's time card. It's very similar, except break and lunch tracking was turned on. The first thing to notice is that when Joe took his paid break at 10:30, he clocked out of a work session and into a paid break session. He returned from his break at 10:44 and clocked back into a work session. But since he was gone longer than the allotted 10 minutes, the paid break session was ended at 10:40 and he was not paid for the extra 3 or 4 minutes he took. Kinda makes you wonder how long Bob's morning break actually was. We can see at a glance that Joe took just over 29 minutes for lunch and that his afternoon break was almost 11 minutes long. With break and lunch tracking turned on, there is no need to read between the lines or do all that math. This next part is a bit easier to follow if we switch the time format to decimal hours. Notice that the daily and weekly subtotals only include those sessions that are both payable and subject to any overtime rules that we might have applied to the time card. This includes sessions like hours worked and paid breaks. Non-payable sessions like at lunch and unpaid breaks are not included in the daily and weekly subtotals, nor in the time card summary. To configure the lunch and break settings, we need to open the admin window by clicking on the gold padlock and entering the admin password. We'll cover how to use the admin window in another chapter. For now, we'll just go to the section controlling breaks and lunches. We do that by selecting the number 7 on the left grid and clicking on the middle tab. Break and lunch tracking is turned on by checking the box to the left of the desired option. If any of these options are enabled, employees will be asked why they are clocking out when they clock out. We can preview this dialog by clicking on the Alternative Phrases tab and the Show Dialog button. Each of the options we enabled are displayed as well as a For the Day option. Clicking on a break or lunch button clocks the employee out of their current work session and into the corresponding break or lunch. Clicking on the For the Day button ends the current session without starting a new session. The Alternative Phrases tab allows you to change the language and/or phrasing used for each of the options. For example, Spanish rather than English. To use our default phrases, just leave the boxes blank. Let's return to the Lunch and Break Settings tab. Notice that in addition to enabling paid breaks, we can also set the maximum duration of the break. Setting the minimum lunch duration to 0 allows employees to clock back in from lunch as soon as they want. If the minimum lunch duration is set to anything greater than 0, employees will be forced to wait for at least a blank number of minutes before they will be allowed to clock back in from lunch. Let's demonstrate how this works by setting the minimum lunch to 30 minutes. And then we'll clock Sally Sales out for lunch, and then try to clock her right back in for lunch. Notice that she is not allowed to clock back in for lunch until her minimum lunch period has expired. If necessary, the administrator can override this state by opening the admin window and changing Sally's status from at lunch to not at lunch. Now Sally will be able to clock back in from lunch. And finally, let's take a look at the auto lunch feature. If enabled, a lunch break session will be added to any day when the employee works more than X hours without taking a lunch break. The length of the lunch break session is entered here, and the number of hours needed to be worked before it is added is entered here. We can use Betty Worker's time card to demonstrate how this works. Betty clocked in earlier today and is just now clocking out. Since she did not take a lunch break session is automatically added to her day.